Minutes ago, Israel confirmed it has launched several strikes inside of Iran with this message from the IDF spokesperson. Take a listen.
Right now, the Israel Defense Forces is conducting precise strikes on military targets in Iran. Like every other sovereign country in the world, the state of Israel has the right and the duty to respond. Our defensive and offensive capabilities are fully mobilized.
Are in response to months of attacks from Iran against Israel, including some 200 ballistic missiles fired earlier this month. Israel Defense Forces say it is conducting precise strikes, as you just heard, on military targets in Iran, while Iranian state media is reporting a number of explosions that rocked the capital of Tehran. NBC News military analyst Colonel Jack Jacobs is with us now. Colonel Jack Jacobs, thanks so much for being with us. First reactions to this news. We knew this was coming. We've been asking about it for weeks now, but a strike in the middle of the night. Do you think that this caught Iran at all off guard?
No, it didn't sound like they caught them off guard. I think they were prepared for it for a long time. It is interesting that, as you mentioned, that it's taken Israel a long time to retaliate. And I think there's been a great deal of discussion inside Israel between the politicians on the one hand and the IDF on the other about what kinds of targets to strike. The original assumption was that they would go in quickly and that they would go in to strike oil transshipment points, oil storage facilities, and the like. And evidently, the decision was made instead to go after military targets. It'll be interesting to see whether or not any of those targets included facilities that are used by or house Republican Guard forces, which are the most dangerous, and they're the closest to the theocracy and keeps them in power. So further reports are necessary, but it looks like military targets, Gadi.
And Iran has repeatedly said that it will respond to Israel's retaliation with aggression. What do you think we could see there? What can we expect?
Well, the assumption is that they will respond, then Israel will respond again. There'll be a continuous escalation until there's a full-scale war. However, there are two things that Iran does not want to have happen. One of them is a full-scale war with Israel. A war which they would have a very, very difficult time winning. The second thing is that the war itself, if it escalates, will have a deleterious effect on what happens inside Iran. There's a great deal of concern by the government of Iran about civil unrest. And civil unrest inside Iran is not very far away. The only reason that the theocracy stays in business is because they're protected by the Republican Guards. If there's a wholesale deterioration of peacefulness inside Iran, if there are huge demonstrations as a result of a large war with Israel, then the regime is definitely in trouble, Gadi.
We'll be watching for that in the coming days. Colonel Jack Jacobs, thanks so much for being with us. Let's turn now to NBC News international correspondent Matt Bradley, who joins us now from Beirut, Lebanon. Thanks so much for being with us. Matt, IDF is saying their offensive and defensive capabilities are fully mobilized. What does that tell us about the nature of the strikes that we're seeing right now?
Yeah, well, it's not just the IDF who's fully mobilized. It looks as though the U.S. is also fully mobilized, and that's the real risk, right? Whether or not we see this whole conflict turning into a region-wide war, and we don't know that at this point. You know, this word unprecedented, it gets bandied about a lot, but we don't know whether or not this is going to become something where we're just seeing the Israelis firing against the Iranians, and we've already seen the Iranian state news agency saying that they've been hearing blasts outside of Tehran, Iran's capital. We don't know whether or not this is going to, invite some sort of retaliation from the Iranians that could really bring in the entire region. And here, speaking to you from Lebanon, that is the real worry, whether or not Iran's main cat's paw here in the whole Middle East, which is Hezbollah, whether or not they're going to be activated into this, whether or not they're going to release the big weapons that we know that they have, and we know that they haven't actually unleashed against the Israelis despite the past year of war. Whether or not this becomes a real region-wide conflict. This is something that has been dreaded by diplomats throughout the entire world, and we don't know whether or not that's going to happen because, as I said, unprecedented. This isn't. We saw this back in April where the Iranians fired the Israelis fired against the Iranians, and it was more or less something that everybody could kind of have a face, save, and climb down. They could kind of say this was a symbolic attack. Everybody could show themselves, and the Iranians and the Israelis, that they had tried to stand up against belligerent neighbors. We don't know whether it's that kind of thing or whether this is something that is going to erupt into something further. It's really just too early to tell.
And Matt, I mean, that brings up the whole question of the proxies, right? So much of this conflict has been about proxies, and yet this is an attack directly at Tehran. What could that invoke from some of the proxies like Hezbollah or like the Houthis?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question. That is the question right now, whether or not these proxies are going to be involved in this. The proxies have already been involved. They've already been firing against the Israelis, and whether or not they're going to continue to do so, or whether or not they've already been crippled by, well, in this case, here in Lebanon, we've seen a year of low-level conflict that now, in the past about 6 weeks, has erupted into a full-on war. The Hezbollah has been badly crippled. Its leader, Hassan Nasrallah, was killed right behind me just a couple of weeks ago here. Whether or not they have the capability to actually bring any power to bear, this is going to be something that the Israelis have been calculated for the past several weeks. The fact is that this has been weeks. It's been nearly a month that the Israelis have been preparing for this retaliation. And they've been doing it under the guise of the Americans and other diplomats who have been trying to tell them over and over again, don't do something that is going to invite a retaliation that could lead to a region-wide war, because that's what's at stake because of these Iranian proxies. We call it, or the Iranians call it, the axis of resistance. These different groups, Hezbollah here in Lebanon, Hamas in the Gaza Strip. We have different Iranian-backed groups in Iraq and Syria, the Houthis in Yemen. They've all been firing in concert. And that has been one of the really extraordinary things about the past year, is that for the first time, the Iranians have been able to watch as they've seen all of these groups who they've been funding and providing political cover for the past year, firing against the Israelis. But the Israelis and their allies, the United States, have been firing back. And they've really actually set them back quite a bit. We've been seeing attacks on the Houthis in Yemen, for example. Whether or not this actually erupts into something further, that is the real question here, especially for civilians, because when it comes to a war like this, when you're talking about a war that doesn't necessarily involve missiles flying over countries, a war that could erupt into an actual ground war, into one that could actually kill more and more civilians, more than we've already seen, that's the real question.
And Matt Bradley, speaking of proxies and allies, we just got this crossing the wires. No U.S. involvement in Israel's military operation against target in Iran. That's coming from a U.S. official. We don't know the nature of the targets other than what the IDF says, that they are military targets. But NBC News has confirmed that they are not striking oil fields or nuclear facilities at this point. What are local media in Tehran saying about these attacks, and where are they saying that they were struck?
Look, I wish I could tell you more. All we're hearing from the local media is that they've heard sounds of bombardments outside of Tehran, the capital. We don't know really anything more than that, and I can't report any more than that. And the fact is that we've seen this before. Like I said, back in April, there was that, and that was unprecedented, that firing back and forth between the Israelis and the Iranians. We don't know whether that, is going to be a repeat, whether or not we're going to see something that's a little bit more symbolic than more strategic. For the Israelis, this is about establishing deterrence. This is about saying, we will stand up to you if you attack us. It's not about, holding a hill or capturing a city. It's a different kind of calculation. It's saying that we are able to actually fight against you, that we will confront you. And that is the kind of thing that is a little bit different from the warfare that we're seeing, for example, in Ukraine. It's not about necessarily being able to take land. It's about a symbolism. It's about being able to show something. And that's something that diplomacy has an avenue to actually stop.
And Matt, real finally, before we let you go for just a sec, I know this is unprecedented territory, but given the attacks that we've seen go back and forth between the proxies and then between Israel and Iran during the ballistic missile attack, right now we're about maybe an hour and a half into whatever possible operation this is. Does it look like there is imminent escalation, or is this possibly a calm wait and see what Iran's going to do? The strike may be over.
Gadi, I don't have the answers for you. I wish I did. I can't tell you whether or not there's going to be an escalation. The only thing I can point to is what happened back in April, where we saw that there was some sort of attack by the Israelis that allowed for everybody to have some sort of diplomatic way of saying that they were climbing down. This is so early in this maneuver that we don't actually know exactly where this is going to lead. The fact is that the Iranians have Hezbollah here in Lebanon. They have the Houthis in Yemen. As I said, they have all of these different groups throughout the entire region. The question is going to become whether or not they become activated. But already they have been set back so much by relentless Israeli attacks, by their own attacks against the Israelis, that it almost decouples them from the calculations in Tehran. So we don't know where this is going, and we don't know the geopolitics involved because things have been changing so much over the past several weeks.
Yeah, and we will continue to monitor them into the night. Matt Bradley out there in Beirut for us. Matt, thank you. Let's bring in NBC News White House correspondent Mike Mimley. Mike, what's the White House saying about this?
Well, Gadi, just a few moments ago, we got our first response from the White House, a National Security Council spokesperson saying simply that we understand that Israel is conducting targeted strikes against military targets in Iran as an exercise of self-defense and in response to Iran's ballistic missile attack against Israel on October 1st. They refer us further to the Israeli government on this matter. Not to overly parse this statement, but it's very specific in terms of what they are saying was the nature of this response so far and what they believe they are responding to, acting in self-defense. It's clear, as the president, we understand, has also been briefed on this matter, having just returned to his home in Delaware. He's not at the White House tonight. All administration efforts, especially since the death of Yahya Sinwar just last week, have been about making sure, doing everything they can to exercise whatever leverage they do have on Israel about exactly what their next steps would be, how and what would be the nature of a response that they have long expected to those missile attacks from Iran on October 1st, as mentioned in this statement. The U.S. obviously wants to avoid a cycle of escalation from only growing worse. And so the National Security Council will be monitoring this throughout the night. The president will be briefed as needed. But they are really largely powerless in this moment, other than in wait-and-see mode, wait and see how the Iranians will respond. Is there more coming from Israel beyond what we understand right now might be that more limited attacks simply on military targets in Iran rather than the more robust response that had been potentially feared by the administration? That's going to dictate what happens from the administration point of view going forward. But we have seen this relentless diplomacy, including Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who just arrived in Israel on Monday, spent several days in the region, had a number of meetings with Arab leaders just today in London, was expected to be on his way back to Washington tonight. We'll certainly see if his itinerary will continue to change as this situation develops as well.
And it looks like the Secretary of State Blinken landed just a little bit ago and didn't take questions. But, I mean, he was in the Middle East, like you said, pushing for this ceasefire. And he was talking about Israel and Iran's conflict just yesterday, adding that they don't want this endless cycle of escalation. It makes you wonder, with the timing of this, whether he knew something, whether he may have been trying to talk between sentences there. But is this what he could have been talking about?
Well, certainly the way this mission was described for the Secretary of State traveling to the Middle East was to focus on what the White House believed was a potential window of opportunity after the death of Sinwar to maybe restart those hostage negotiations to see a ceasefire in that much more limited conflict in Gaza. Obviously, the broader concern about what would be the potential retaliation against Iran, what the continued response to Iranian proxies more broadly throughout the region, especially in Lebanon, would be, certainly was a topic of discussion as well. But officially, officials had stressed that this was simply a round of talks focused on restarting those talks about the hostage crisis. I think it's interesting, Gadi, the way these diplomatic endeavors work, that the Israeli action at this point did not happen until after Secretary of State Blinken had left London. He was already in the air, returning to the United States. One, especially given the tense nature of some of his meetings in Israel, would understand that they did not want to take any action while this senior U.S. official was on the ground meeting with their officials. Despite all the difficulties and the differences between the U.S. and the Israelis, even President Biden has acknowledged the tension with Prime Minister Netanyahu. That has not stopped them from also stating in the same breath the close alliance, the essential partnership between the U.S. to continue to support Israel's self-defense, including sending U.S. Troops to Israel to potentially work with them and to man a U.S.-run ballistic missile response system. That cooperation, that support continues to this moment. But yes, it certainly, I think, speaks to the nature of this moment that Secretary Blinken it was not until he was in the air coming back to the United States that we understand that this mission has begun on the part of Israel.
Yeah, and Mike Mimley, you know, as soon as we asked that, we just got a note from Kelly O'Donnell, our colleague, who said that a senior official says the United States did have advance notice. However, the United States did not participate militarily in this operation. So all of these things developing now. The president has been briefed and is closely following developments. Mike Mimley will be checking back with you in just a bit. Thanks so much for that update. And as we continue to monitor what's happening over in Iran and this strike that the IDF says that they have just implemented in response to the ballistic missile strike that happened on October 1st. Let's bring in NBC's senior national security correspondent, Courtney Kube. Courtney, the big question tonight, what in Iran is Israel targeting or not targeting, and what do we know right now about what they've hit?
So we don't know a lot of specifics, but we are learning more about sort of the broad outlines of what Israel was targeting tonight. And the easiest way to describe them is they appear to be military targets. So for weeks now, everyone has been waiting and trying to figure out exactly what Israel was going to do to respond to this barrage of nearly 200 Iranian ballistic missiles that Iran fired at Israel several weeks ago. During that time, the three main categories have really been military targets, energy targets, and nuclear. It appears so far at this point that the Israelis have stuck to military targets. So the sorts of things that we should be listening for are weapons depots, storage facilities where Iran might store things like missiles and drones, the sorts of things that Iran has been targeting Israel with, and Iranian proxies have been targeting Israel with over the last year now, since October 7th. Those are the types of things that we expect that we will hear about, but it's not really clear if they went beyond that. Now, U.S. officials in recent days have been more and more confident that Israel's response here would be proportional. So think about what that could mean, Gadi. If it's proportional to the Iranian attack from several weeks ago, they may also go after ballistic missile launchers or the sorts of places, maybe airfields, that Iran was able to use to target Israel in that attack on October 1st. So again, we don't know yet anything more than the broad contours or outlines of what it was that Israel went after here. But at this point, it does not appear that they went after the other two categories: energy, oil and gas fields, the kind of thing that could really cripple Iran's economy if it was really targeted and attacked. And then, very critically, it does not appear that they went after any of the Iranian nuclear facilities. And why that is so important right now is Iran has made it very clear that if Israel were to seriously target any of their nuclear facilities, that would be considered the next step up in escalation. And then we would be talking about what Iran could be doing to then retaliate again back here, Gadi.
And again, so much of this is happening right now, and so much of this has happened just recently. So we are still painting the outline of what's been hit. We just got a note from our Tehran producer that is there on the ground from NBC, and they are saying that local reports are saying that several military bases in the west and southwest of Tehran were targeted by the Israeli regime's attack. Again, no specifics there, but very close to Tehran. There are also unconfirmed reports about targeting of the Revolutionary Guard, which would be a natural target for the Israelis. And so the question is, if this has been in anticipation, if the anticipation has been there for more than 2 weeks now, what would Iran have done in some of these bases? Would they have been hardening some of those facilities, and would they have moved possibly some of the weapons to different locations?
Yes, absolutely. So they would have moved. They could have potentially moved things like their aircraft out of the way. They could have done exactly what you just said, hardened some of their facilities, moved people out of some of those places, and then very, very importantly, some of their missiles may have been moved. But in addition to that, Iran has been readying for this defensively. So they could have gotten some of their air defense systems. I will say, if it does turn out, as it appears so far, that some of these strikes were closer into Tehran, this is not just about hurting Iran's military capability. This is also about signaling to Iran and the leaders in Iran that Israel can hit them near Tehran. This is if in fact that's what has happened here, that is a very symbolic strike. And why that's also important is, you'll remember back in April, so Iran launched off hundreds of projectiles, missiles, drones towards Israel. The majority of them were shot down. Israel responded by targeting right near several of Iran's nuclear facilities. And this may be another symbolic attack showing Iran that Israel has the ability to hit them as far in as Tehran. And why that's so important for our viewers to know is that's a real signal to the leadership that they can get them inside Tehran.
Yeah, a very powerful message, especially since so much of this conflict has dealt with proxies. Now, as we see if Iran is going to retaliate or counterstrike Israel, can you walk us through some of the defenses that Israel has? I know you've been doing some incredible reporting on the THAAD battery that the United States has sent over to Israel. What is that, and what are the defenses that Israel has in place right now?
Yeah, so the THAAD is now in Israel. Why that's important is it has the ability to defend against incoming ballistic missiles, and it takes them out in the terminal phase. The THAAD, the T in THAAD, stands for terminal. That means that literally in the final moments before an incoming missile is able to strike, the THAAD battery fires off an interceptor and takes it out. It's a kinetic kill vehicle. That means it doesn't have a warhead on it, the interceptor. In fact, it literally just slams into the incoming missile with the idea that it's going to use that missile's own warhead or explosives to blow itself up. But it's not just that ability. Why the THAAD is really important here, Gadi, is because the radar system that deploys with the THAAD battery has a huge range. It can see something that's coming hundreds and hundreds of miles away. It has the ability to really give Israel a heads up. Hey, there is a missile that was just launched off from Western Iran, and it's coming, and this is where it's projected to land. So Israel already has a huge air defense systems, but now the U.S. has shored it up with this THAAD battery. But not just that. Since April, the U.S. has also surged in additional military capability to the region in the form of additional manned aircraft, additional personnel, and more ballistic missile defense ships. Now, you'll remember when Iran attacked Israel now on October 1st, so several weeks ago, the U.S. actually did launch off several interceptors to take out some of those incoming missiles. Israel is very well defended right now from an air defense perspective, but the hope here from U.S. officials is that this is not going to be another back and forth, another tit for tat from Israel and from Iran, and that hopefully if this is more of a proportional strike by Israel tonight, that it may just end here.
And Courtney, I wanted to ask, and I've been wanting to ask you this for a while, what did we learn from the defensive capabilities that the Israelis had, and as well as the ones that were deployed by the United States in that first ballistic missile strike? Ballistic missile strikes are not something that happens very often, so the defensive capabilities somewhat are untested, if I understand correctly, until something like this happens, right?
And I have to say, you know, I feel like people may be becoming numb to the fact that there are a lot of advanced air defense systems that can take out these ballistic missiles. Gadi, this is a very precise science that's going on here, okay? So think about it. The word ballistic, that we hear that often, ballistics with gunfire. This is literally a missile that's going up to take out a missile. Think of two bullets trying to take out a bullet with another bullet. They're big bullets here, but still, that's the basic science of it. It is very difficult. It is not always, and it's not always successful. You'll often hear about in an air defense system, in a huge attack like this, that the air defense systems will fire off multiple interceptors for every incoming missile. So one thing that has really changed over the last year or so, since this back and forth, is that people are talking much more openly about concerns about the interceptor stockpiles. You know, if you have hundreds of potential incoming, and remember here, this is not just about these Iranian back and forth. Israel has been under attack really on a daily basis from proxies, from the Houthis, from Hezbollah, from Hamas. They have used a tremendous number of interceptors and air defense systems, David Sling, Iron Dome, in the last 13 months or so. There is a real concern that if this back and forth continues, we're going to be talking about depleted air defense systems. The interceptors are difficult to make. They're expensive. And again, the Israelis and the U.S. have been using a ton of them. The U.S. has also been using a lot of these interceptors against the Houthis. They're firing off from Yemen towards Israel. The vast majority of them are getting stopped over the Red Sea well before they get to Israel. And most of the time, they're being stopped by the U.S. military, Gadi.
Yeah, Courtney Kube, your expertise on this is always so astounding. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, and we'll check back with you in a bit.
Thank you.
And let's bring in NBC News senior national security and intelligence analyst John Brennan. John, your reaction to these Israeli strikes inside of Iran, were you expecting them in these coming days here?
I think we've been anticipating them for the past couple of weeks. And I do think that there's been a sigh of relief in the White House, at least according to the early reports, that it appears that Bibi Netanyahu did not select the high option as far as retaliation, and he did not decide to go after the energy facilities, oil refineries, as well as possible nuclear sites, and has just kept it limited to military targets. And in Iran and around Tehran, there are readily identifiable Iranian military targets, whether it be airfields or weapon depots or training facilities and so on. And so it sounds as though Israel was going after Iran's capability to continue to launch these missile strikes against Israel. As Courtney pointed out, the Iranians have had an opportunity over the past couple of weeks to prepare for these strikes. But at the same time, the Israelis have very good intelligence and very, very formidable capabilities to carry out these precise attacks. And they were carried out at night, and there's been references to barracks, Iranian military barracks, whether they be the Iranian regular army military or Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC. And so I think one of the big questions is how many casualties were a result of these strikes. Now, unlike Hamas and Hezbollah, that have a lot of their members inside of civilian apartment buildings and areas, these Iranian military facilities are not commingled with civilian populations the way Hamas and Hezbollah have. So therefore, I'm hoping that the number of civilian casualties is at a minimum, if not none at all. So again, by the White House statement, these were targeted strikes against Iranian military targets that the Israelis carried out, and we'll have to see how the Iranians are going to respond. First, they will have some type of public statements, but hopefully it's not going to lead to the Iranians deciding that they now, as a result of these strikes, have to respond somewhat in kind.
And pick it up a little bit about the barracks, the possibility that barracks have been struck. I've been seeing unconfirmed reports, but the obvious target, or one of the most obvious targets, would have been the bases housing the Revolutionary Guard, right? So what would the Revolutionary Guard have done to prepare for a retaliation from Israel after the ballistic missile strikes in early October?
Well, they could have dispersed some of their forces that usually would be in barracks, and so maybe they moved them out and told them to stay home and try to have as few people as possible in these barracks that, again, are easily targeted by the Israeli military. And I'm hoping that the Israelis were not just trying to cause as many casualties as possible. They can do a lot of damage by destroying the infrastructure of Iran's military, again, airfields, the weapon depots, taking away the stockpiles that the Iranians have. But I think the Iranians, probably had some limited advance warning that these strikes were going to happen in terms of their air defense systems were alerted. So they could have taken some time to move some of these military members out of harm's way. We'll just have to wait and see with the day's break tomorrow to see what type of damage was done, and again on the casualty front, and whether or not there were some senior officers that were targeted. I heard references to Iranian military officers. So we'll have to see again just how significant the damage was.
And right now, as we wait and see, in Tehran and all around Iran, there are military leaders there that are discussing what a retaliation from them might look like, right? So given what they learned from the interceptions that happened during October 1st and that earlier missile strike, the ballistic missile strike, what do you think the options are that are on the table in Iran right now for retaliation in response to what we're seeing tonight?
Well, I think, as we mentioned before, but I think Matt as well as Courtney, the Iranian options are increasingly limited because a number of their proxies have been defanged as a result of Israeli military strikes inside of Gaza, Lebanon, and Yemen, as well as inside of Iraq and now Syria as well. And the Iranians, I think, recognize that Israeli air defense systems are really, really tough to penetrate. As Courtney was mentioning, there's a real premium that the Israelis put on redundancy so that they have a lot of different capabilities to be able to intercept these rockets, missiles, and drones as they're coming in. And so I think the Iranians recognize that their ability to do damage inside of Israel proper is really quite limited. That's why the question of whether or not Iran is going to resort to some of its tactics that it's used in the past in terms of international terrorism. Hezbollah certainly has a terrorist capability, but I know that Israel is hardening some of their diplomatic facilities as well as taking the appropriate precautions. But again, in terms of Iran's military capabilities to lash out and damage the Israelis, it's limited at this point and probably decreasing as a result of Israel's continued the attrition that it is taking on Iranian military forces.
Now that we're hearing that energy sites may not have been struck, that oil refinery depots, and that this might not have been targeting of infrastructure, do you think that there's a possibility still that Iran may try to retaliate by disrupting supply chains that go into Israel?
Well, it's certainly a possibility, but again, I think we have to wait to find out exactly how much damage was done. And the more damage done, I think the more pressure there's going to be on the Iranian leadership. There is a new Iranian president. He is known as a bit of a reformer, but he doesn't basically make the decisions as far as the military posture to take. The supreme leader, Khamenei, as well as with the senior military leadership, I think they're the ones that are going to determine whether or not there is a possible effective means that Iran can respond or retaliate. But I don't think at this point Iran really wants to get into an escalatory spiral with Israel, which could in fact bring in the United States, because Iran will lose in that scenario. So therefore, I think they're going to see what they can do without sparking some type of regional conflagration that will damage them certainly more than others. But yes, it's one of the things that they could do. In the past, they have put mines in the Persian Gulf and even in the Red Sea in years past to try to interrupt international shipping as a way to signal that they do have a capability themselves. But again, I think that they're probably scratching their heads at this point to decide how they're going to respond. Maybe they're going to do it, again, in an asymmetric way because they know that their ability to get through Israeli air defenses has proven to be quite hapless in the past.
If they do continue to escalate, but they escalate through their proxies, how do you see that impacting, I hate to say it, but the election is right around the corner here in the United States. How do you see it impacting politics here at home?
Well, again, I think a lot depends on how escalatory this becomes. I know the Biden administration certainly has been doing everything possible to try to bring the bloodshed and the fighting to a close. And I think they would like to be able to get back to the idea of a ceasefire in Gaza, as well as a ceasefire even in Lebanon, and to get the hostages home. But if this continues to escalate, it's difficult for me to see how there's going to be some type of ceasefire either in the Gaza front or in Lebanon. So I do worry that a continued escalation here is just going to, I think, be used as a way to show that U.S. influence in the region to be able to stop this is not as great as maybe it once was.
John Brennan, we always appreciate your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Scott.
And let's turn to NBC News Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons. He is in Moscow. Hey, Keir, we want to show you this picture of Benjamin Netanyahu as the strikes went down just a little while ago. This picture has been posted in the last 15, 20 minutes or so. How do you think planning for this went for Israel? Because this is a response that is weeks in the making now, right?
Yeah, it was prolonged, Gadi. It took time. And I think one of the reasons why it took so long, if you like, is we're now seeing tonight. It's now coming up towards 4 a.m. here in Moscow. Tehran is half an hour ahead of us, so past 4 a.m. But what it does look like at this stage, what we're being told by the Israelis and by the US, is that these are military targets. And that's crucial because there was the option, and you've been talking about it in the past hour, Gadi, there was the option to hit fuel depots in Iran. That would have had an impact on oil prices around the world ahead of the US election. There was even the option to hit Iran's nuclear program. None of that, it appears, has taken place. So the Israelis have carried out a precise and frankly careful strike, as far as we can tell at this stage. Places like Isfahan, we are hearing that there have been potential explosions there. Now that is close to Iran's nuclear program, but it is also a military base. And so with a strike like that, and that the last time Israel hit Iran this year, we saw a similar thing. With a strike like that, Israel has the capability to kind of signal to Tehran that it could target Iran's nuclear program, but without actually doing so. Why does all that matter? Why do the weeks that it's taken for this to happen matter? Well, it matters because there has been an enormous diplomatic effort by the Biden administration and even by Iran itself to push Israel to not escalate beyond just those, if you like, just those military targets, in the hope that Iran won't respond in the way that many of your contributors have been talking about, Gadi, through this analysis since we first heard about these explosions around Tehran, around Damascus. Potentially, there are military targets all across the western area of Iran, the closest part of Iran, if you like, to Israel, though still a good distance away from Israel. So it does have plenty of targets. And I think another question, given that what we are seeing, what we are hearing is that these are military targets. I think another question is just to what extent has Israel decided to try to take out, if you like, Iran's missile capability, its ballistic missile capability, for example, to kind of deaden Iran's ability to strike at Israel. Another question, too, is how has Israel carried out these strikes? Has it used its own missile capability or has it used manned aircraft, aircraft with people in them, if you like? And that's, I think the latter, it may be that even the latter hasn't happened. And one of the reasons for that is that in these past weeks, Arab states in the region have been signaling very clearly that they would not open their airspace to Israel. So it was going to be extremely challenging for Israel to use manned aircraft to carry out these strikes. They could fly along a border, the border of Iraq, for example, kind of a sort of no man's land, if you like, and by doing that, say that they're not in anyone's airspace, but that is an extremely challenging operation. These are the questions we're going to find out in the coming hours. Again, here in Russia and in the Middle East, it's the middle of the night, so it may take a while before we get the answers to some of these questions.
It's the middle of the night, and you are in Russia, so I do want to ask, we just saw Iran at the BRICS, right? And I know you were reporting on the BRICS, and I know that that's mostly centered around trade and opening up and establishing very deep relations between these countries. But we do know that Iran has this connection to Moscow and to Russia. How do you see Russia playing into any of this, if at all?
Oh, yeah, I mean, absolutely. No question. And you're right. I mean, the BRICS was a meeting of emerging nations, emerging economies, but there will have been a lot of strategic conversations. We actually saw President Pezeshkian of Iran kind of storm past us at that summit with an entourage. I mean, it looked like, 20, 30 officials around him, kind of in emergency mode, if you like. I think the Iranians have been in emergency mode ever since their strike on Israel, and Israel being clear that it intended to retaliate. So there will have been many meetings. Just keep in mind, just think about who was at that summit. It wasn't just the Russians. The United Arab Emirates was there, Egypt was there, Turkey, President Erdogan was there, and there were bilateral meetings between all of those leaders, and the Iranians will have been attempting to do whatever they could to put pressure on Israel not to carry out strikes beyond, and I think we may be able to say by tomorrow, beyond the kinds of strikes that Israel has carried out through the night tonight. And the way that Iran's been doing that, one of the ways that Iran has been doing that is by threatening those Arab nations, saying if you open up your airspace to Israel, we will target military bases or fuel depots in your territory. Those have been kind of quiet threats, not made in public necessarily, but while at the same time Iran has been very openly threatening Israel and the US. So we've seen this effort by the Iranians, and we saw it up close here in Russia in just the past few days to manage Israel's response, if you like, to put pressure on Israel not to respond to too great an extent. You've been talking about the potential for civilian casualties. That would be the kind of thing that might leave Tehran in a position where it then felt that it needed to respond again. But that's just the kind of escalation that, as you have been saying in this past hour, Washington has been trying to avoid, the Biden administration has been trying to avoid.
And Keir, last question. I mean, this strike, effectively in the heart of Tehran, what kind of message does that not only send to Iran, but to the other nations that Iran may be trying to pressure to avoid allowing Israel into their airspace?
Well, we have to wait and see where Israel has really struck, because Iran does have air defenses. It is possible that the kinds of explosions that people are witnessing can be Iran's air defenses. Iran is the kind of place where there can be strikes that we won't know about for a while. Again, there are there are a number of military bases across Iranian territory. So I mean, listen, just because Israel may have limited its strikes to military targets, that there are many targets that Israel could put its focus on, could have put its focus on through the night. So let's see whether areas around Tehran and potentially around Damascus and Syria are the only places that Israel has targeted tonight.
And as you're saying this, Kieran, again, so many of these details come in as we're reporting. It's always fascinating to hear your analysis, and then the details come in matching up exactly with what you're saying. We just got Yasmin Vasugian just sent this in. Iranian state media inside of Iran is downplaying the strikes inside Tehran. Several people inside Iran report hearing explosions, but they're unable to see what they are. Apparently, Iranian state media is denying strikes near the Imam Khomeini airport or the Khomeini gravesite, despite other media outlets reporting strikes near the airport. So again, it looks like a little bit of downplaying happening in real time right now in Iran, but we still, as you were saying, don't have a clear picture of exactly what was hit, right?
Right, but that's the kind of thing that, seen from, for example, the Biden administration's perspective, that's the kind of thing that they would want to be hearing. Iran playing down the strikes. Perhaps the strikes really have been limited, but certainly what you want, if you're the Biden administration, and with all the diplomacy that we've been watching and hearing through these past weeks, what you want is for Israel to carry out these strikes, and then for Tehran to say that they are limited, to say, and to be able to say, if you like, well, Israel didn't really hit anything. Iran will say that. That won't necessarily be the case. Again, Israel has the ability, has the sophisticated ability to take out, if you like, Iranian capabilities, and we may not know about it for hours.
Keir Simmons out there in Moscow for us. Keir, thank you. And we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with what's happening right now in the Middle East, these airstrikes effective against Iran. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, we are following breaking news. Israel has fired retaliatory strikes inside of Iran. Let's go to NBC News international correspondent Raf Sanchez, who joins us now from Tel Aviv. Raf, we haven't heard too much from Iranian media on the casualties or the results of these strikes. Is there a chance that they could be downplaying the severity of the attack, or did Iran's defensive hold up?
You know, Gadi, at this point, I think it's just too early to tell. It's very possible that this Israeli strike is still underway as we speak. It's just been an hour and 15 minutes since Israel officially confirmed it was carrying out what it called precise strikes against military targets inside of Iran. We know from Iranian state television there were explosions reported in the greater Tehran area, not necessarily in the center of the city itself, but on the outskirts of the Iranian capital. We do not know exactly what it is that Israel has struck. We don't know if those strikes are limited to Tehran. I did just get off the phone with an Israeli official. They tell me that Israel is not targeting Iranian nuclear facilities and that it is not targeting Iranian oil fields. Now, that is significant, Gadi, because there has been deep concern inside the White House over the last 3 weeks that an Israeli strike on nuclear facilities, the most sensitive sites inside Iran, would be the kind of thing that would trigger an all-out regional war. They were also deeply concerned that an Israeli attack on oil fields could send oil prices spiraling. That would have knock-on effects all across the global economy, to say nothing of being just 2 weeks out from the American presidential election. That could be something that would send significant geopolitical shockwaves all across the world. Now, this Israeli official says these strikes are focused on elements of Iranian infrastructure that have threatened Israel in the past or could threaten Israel in the future. This official would not be more specific than that. But just thinking about this, a little more than 3 weeks ago, the skies over Israel were lit up with a barrage of some 180 Iranian ballistic missiles. They were fired from Iran. They took just 11 minutes to fly several hundred miles here to Israel. They struck several air bases. Some of them landed in civilian areas. No Israelis were killed as a result of those strikes. Most of them were shot down, or some of them, I should say, were shot down by Israel's air defenses. One Palestinian man was killed in the occupied West Bank. But Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli leadership, made very clear in public and in private that they intended to retaliate. And tonight, that retaliation is underway. And we should be really clear, Gadi, that even in the confusion, the chaos, one thing we know, we are living through history right now. Iran fired a wave of missiles, drones, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles back in April. That was the first time that Iran has carried out a direct attack against Israel. In their 40 years of enmity, Iran had never directly attacked Israel from its own soil. Tonight, for the first time, we are seeing Israel publicly acknowledging that it is carrying out a direct attack against Iranian soil. So what has been a decades-long shadow war has now spilled out into the open, into the light. And the question at this point, Gadi, is how will Iran respond? Gadi.
And we've learned so much about the Israeli defense systems, the Iron Dome, the THAAD system that now is in Israel. What do we know about Iran's defense capabilities and their ability to prevent or strike down missiles?
They are not as sophisticated as Israel's. Iran relies on a lot of Soviet-era missile technology. You may remember that after the United States assassinated Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Quds Force, it's an element of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, that Iran fired a barrage of missiles at an American airbase in Iraq, and the Iranians were bracing for retaliation. They thought it was highly likely that the Trump administration might order strikes. And in that state of high alert that Iran's air defenses were in, they actually ended up accidentally shooting down a civilian airliner that was taking off from the airport in Tehran. They killed well over 100 people. And I tell you that story only to indicate that that shows you that this is not a highly sophisticated Iranian air defense system. Just to give you another example, Gadi, Israel has been carrying out strikes inside of Syria, an Iranian ally, for years now. To my knowledge, a single Israeli manned aircraft, an F-16, was shot down by those Syrian air defenses. So Israel has cutting-edge fighter jets. Iranian air defenses are limited. We just don't know at this point what they were able to intercept. We don't know what the Israelis were able to hit. But I think it is fairly unlikely that if Israel was carrying out a large-scale and determined set of airstrikes, that Iranian air defenses would be able to do much to repel it. Gadi.
And Raf, switching over to offensive capability, if Iran does choose to respond in kind to Israel, what would that look like?
So it likely would look similar to what we saw on October 1st, but potentially on a larger scale. Those ballistic missiles have the advantage of being so fast. They move so quickly, it gives Israel very little time to respond. That is in contrast to those drones, to those cruise missiles, which are much, much slower. They take hours to cross the Middle East to get from Iran to Israel. Those hours back in April gave the United States, Israel, some Arab governments, some European governments plenty of time to shoot down most of that incoming. But those ballistic missiles, there's very, very little time. They fired around 180 back in October, but they have a much larger arsenal. And if they choose, they could fire several hundreds, potentially thousands all at once. Gadi.
Raf Sanchez in Tel Aviv. Raf, thank you. And let's bring back NBC News White House correspondent Mike Mimley. Mike, anything new from the White House?
Well, I think what's notable at this moment is that we understand, I mentioned earlier that President Biden has been briefed on the latest developments, but now we can add that Vice President Harris has as well. Why is that notable? Because the vice president's about to get on stage at a campaign event in Houston, a rally that features none other than Beyonce. The program is already underway there. And this speaks to, I think, what is an extra layer to this story as we are now just about 10 days left until the presidential election. I mentioned President Biden had spent today in Arizona, had just landed back in his hometown of Wilmington, Delaware, was at his residence. As we understand, he has been getting briefed on this matter. I think as we wait to see the seriousness, just how much of an escalation this is, how Iran responds, one of the clues we'll be looking at is, does this change the campaign itinerary for the president and the vice president? Tonight, the vice president is in Houston. Tomorrow, she has a campaign event scheduled in Kalamazoo, Michigan. President Biden is scheduled to travel to Pittsburgh for a meeting and a political event with some union officials in that key part of a key battleground state. So as we try to make sense of what this situation means and just the seriousness of it going forward, that's going to be one of the clues we look for. Is there any changes in the campaign schedule so that they can come back to the White House behind me for meetings with the national security team in person? Or is this something that they can continue to get briefed on and manage from as they're maintaining their very busy campaign schedule here, Gadi?
And Mike, we were just talking to Keir Simmons about BRICS diplomacy. When it comes to the allies of Israel, what is the diplomacy going to look like in the next coming days?
Well, you can expect that, as we understand, the White House has been had some advance notice. We talked about Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who just landed back in Washington a few moments ago. There's going to be intensive diplomacy continuing, not just the direct coordination and communication with Israel, but our Arab partners in the region. The White House has been in constant contact with various different leaders at various levels throughout the region to continue to try to exert pressure, not just and any leverage we have, not just on the Israelis, but on our partners to be intermediaries in speaking with the Iranians as well.
Mike Mimley, thank you. And let's turn now to NBC senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube. Courtney, the big question, what in Iran is Israel targeting? We've been talking, and again, you know, it's very, very preliminary here. But if they are targeting the Revolutionary Guard, what would they hit by hitting those barracks? And would that be symbolic, or is that an actual military target that could decrease their capabilities?
So what the U.S. military has been urging the Israelis to do here is to go after these proportional military targets. So the sorts of things that could be used to target Israel again in the future. So think about this, exactly how Iran has attacked Israel over the last several months. We've seen ballistic missiles. That was the most recent barrage. We've also seen drones launched towards them. A proportional strike would generally be going after the launchers for those ballistic missiles, going after some of the air bases where their manned aircraft launch from and reside, and then maybe going after some of the stockpiles for their weapons. So some of the warehouses for their ballistic missiles, the warehouses for their drones, those would be considered proportional military targets. Now, we don't have a whole lot of fidelity yet at this point, but I would expect that those are the sorts of things that we will hear about. Now, the big question is, were they able to successfully hit some of these targets? And how was Iran already prepared for this retaliation tonight? As we have seen with these back and forths, both sides prepare for their defensive capabilities. In the case of Iran, they could move some aircraft out of the way. They could harden some of their buildings. They could move some of their systems further away. If, in fact, some of these strikes were in the western part of Iran, it's possible they could have moved things further east. So these are all the questions that we have right now. I do expect that we will also hear more about them targeting Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps sites specifically, Gadi.
Courtney Kube, thank you so much for joining us. And we actually have some video from the IDF that we want to play right now, talking about the strike from their words. So let's take a look at that if we've got that.
Right now, the Israel Defense Forces is conducting precise strikes on military targets in Iran. Like every other sovereign country in the world, the state of Israel has the right and the duty to respond. Our defensive and offensive capabilities are fully mobilized.
Now, the big question tonight is, what did they hit? We are all waiting for answers on that soon. That's going to do it for us tonight as we come up against this hour. I'm Gadi Schwartz. Stay with NBC News now for continuing coverage of this breaking story. That news continues right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.